Outstanding. Okay, next up is infrastructure. Carrie, so what you want to do is ding the time at 10:15. Okay? I mean, double ding it at 10:15. So 10:14, it's one ding, double ding it at 10:15. Okay.
You know, listening to the last presentation, I was wishing my 9th grade son was sitting there. He literally just said before I left for this trip, I underlined all my stuff, Dad, from my social studies test. I don't think he was studying. So I'm John Wilkins. I'm the managing director at the Federal Communications Commission in Washington. That means that I'm basically the COO. Other than trying to navigate my agency through the craziness of Washington, pretty much my main assignment from my boss, the chairman of the FCC, has been working on E-rate modernization for the last 2 years. So we're going to talk about, I think, the very beginning of your agenda for the day, which is the infrastructure that it takes to deliver digital learning to schools. I'm going to start just with a few basic principles about E-rate. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, others maybe less so. E-rate fundamentally, from the federal government perspective, is a recognition that communications infrastructure to schools is just as important of a national interest, frankly, as highways are for the economy. So what E-rate fundamentally is, it's a federal funding stream that is available for the use of schools and libraries to build communications connections for the use of students, faculty, staff, or library patrons. It was created in 1997 by Congress. As of today, it is not only it's the largest federal technology funding program in the country. I think, based on a few changes last year, it's now the 3rd largest federal education funding program of any type. Just to give you a sense of a few numbers, so since the inception of E-rate in 1997, Texas schools have received over $4 billion in cumulative funding since 1997. And in a typical year, Texas will receive around $230 to $250 million. And I'll talk in a minute about how that quite likely could go up in real ways in the years ahead, because that's just the historical run rate. I think one other quick thing on E-rate, just so you think about it from a funding perspective, E-rate is not subject to annual federal appropriations. I think we're sitting in the appropriations hearing room, so it's an important note to make. E-rate's a function of the Telecom Act of 1996, which is sort of the FCC's governing statute. But the authority to fund E-rate is not subject to annual federal budget cycles, which, as we know, can be a bit up and down in terms of how they may play out for various funding priorities. So E-rate is going to be there. And so I think as you think about your planning, and we'll talk more about this over the next hour, I think that's a really important point of emphasis that we've made at the FCC, which is to make it really clear that the funding stream will be there, because the kind of things that are being talked about in lots of states, and I think you're starting to contemplate, certainly involve a step up at the state and local level on these projects and these needs, and there is a funding contribution required locally, but the federal money will be there, and that was a very important point of emphasis for us. So just a quick bit of history. So in 1997, very few schools in the country had internet connections of any kind, dial-up, right, modems, or the really advanced schools may have a T1 line, which right now that's a lot slower than most of us have at home for our home broadband connections. So the original goal of E-rate was just to connect every school in the country to the internet. And by all accounts, it was a fabulously successful program. Within 10 years or so, that goal had almost entirely been achieved. But as always, government moves a lot more slowly than markets, and especially in the telecom and high-tech world, what really was starting to be the case even 5 to 10 years ago, let alone the last couple of years, is that the needs of schools were pretty quickly outstripping the original concept of the program, right? So originally, in 1998 or 1999, it was pretty simple, right? You'd say, okay, I'm a district or even a school level technology administrator. We want to get internet to the school. So we'll call up our local telecom provider, Bell South, or let's see, 1998, before the various mergers, it would have been, Meritech or Pac Bell, wherever you were in the country. You might order a T1 line, might cost you a couple $1,000s a month. You'd file for your E-rate funding, you'd get it, and you're online. You'd have a connection in the library, right? You didn't have connections in all the classrooms, and it was relatively simple. And there's an important point, which is E-rate still today works with that basic model. So E-rate at its core is a local bottom-up process. Local level or the district level more commonly these days, and then in some states with some coordination at the state level, and we could talk about that. But at its core, it's a school in some grouping that says, okay, this is what we need. You apply to the E-rate program. Other than some rules to make sure the money goes to what it's supposed to, I mean, there are rules around you can't get E-rate money to, build a new football stadium or something, but other than those rules, it's really no strings attached. I mean, if it qualifies as a service and you can show that you made a reasonable effort to get a competitive price for it, E-rate will fund it. And it's really not any kind of a top-down federal mandate around what you're allowed to buy and how much you're allowed to pay. It really is a bottom-up process. And then the mechanics are pretty simple. There's a total price for what you want to pay, depending on the poverty level in the school. So we use the subsidized school lunch as the metric. The school will pay somewhere between, for the most affluent schools, say 20% of the price the program will pay, and the school pays 80%. But in higher poverty schools, E-rate will pay 80 or even 90% of the price. So it really is that simple. You say what you need, does it qualify under the rules of the program, and E-rate will fund, on a national basis, E-rate funds about 70% of the cost. So it's a pretty good deal. I mean, that's a pretty substantial federal subsidy with requirements only around the nature of what's being bought, not lots of other strings attached. Now, as we fast forward, though, through that early era, where it was basically just getting an internet connection to the school, we see lots of big changes. So, connections to the classroom. Those of you that have worked in the local school environment know. Well, we went first. There was, well, how do we get from the library to the schools? Well, maybe we do hard wiring, right? We'd have Ethernet connections like we used to have in our offices, and you'd plug into the wall in the classroom. And then you bring in Wi-Fi more and more. Now, of course, that's the simple standard. As the need for bandwidth grows, how do you go from that slower T1 speed connection to a fiber optic connection? Now, E-rate did try over the years to keep pace, and there was a sort of a steady diet of small changes to try to support that really fast evolution of school technology. But what the FCC concluded beginning in late 2013, which is when we started this process, and very much, I think, reflecting a broader consensus around the country that we needed to modernize, was that just the gaps were growing too quickly without a real overhaul of the E-rate program. And so, a couple of flavors of gap. The gaps between schools in the country that had the right, I would just say, convergence of factors. Probably most importantly, just local expertise, right? The difference between saying, let's get an internet connection to the school, to let's have a sophisticated strategy for a district-wide WAN that will give us gigabit connections and allow every school to connect to the internet really quickly, and a Wi-Fi service that will allow it to go to the school. I mean, those are things that if you have the expertise are doable, but they are complex. And in a given district, in a given school, it's been hit or miss. And we could talk more around how Tony's a lot of experience with that too. But so schools where you had that right expertise, you had some just local or district level leadership, and importantly, the funding, right? E-rate still pays the bulk of the freight, but if you buy a more expensive service, your share of that expensive service will grow some. But where those factors came together, we saw schools that had, frankly, connectivity at the level you'd expect of a business. I mean, it just absolutely no barrier on the infrastructure side to doing whatever other innovations the school wanted to do in terms of content or digital learning or things you're going to talk about later today. On the other end of the spectrum, we saw lots of schools that had, frankly, internet access that was 10 to 15 years behind what you would expect, even in a small business. I mean, just frankly, impossible to use technology in any really effective way because there were just too many limitations. So that was a gap. And from the program perspective, I think the gap that we really saw, that really came from the first gap, was that the demands on the program were going to grow and grow and grow to the point where it wouldn't be able to fulfill its core mission. So I'll just give you two examples. Pretty well documented that, and schools are no exception to this, in sort of an institutional environment, a school, a medium-sized business, just the demand for bandwidth, the demand for bits that you can send to and from the internet is roughly doubling every 2 to 3 years, right? And this is just because it's as simple as things like, okay, well, you bring all of the Chromebooks into the classroom, and the teachers start using some content that has video in it. And the kids kind of like it, or the teachers find that it's effective. And so they share it, and all of a sudden the whole school is doing that. The effects that has on the demands that the school has to support, it's a very steep curve, not an incremental one. And so we took that fact and said, well, based on how we see E-rate funding going, can E-rate sustain it in its current construction? And what we concluded was no. And one of the very leading indicators that we saw, E-rate has two components. One component for your connections to the schools and one component for Wi-Fi or connections inside the school. Essentially, where the program was trending was running out of money to support Wi-Fi. And so any of you that have been involved in E-rate in your districts, in 2000, well, over the last 3 years until this year, we went from 10% to 5% to no schools having enough support to do internal connections. And that really just reflected the growing demands on the program as more and more schools were requesting more expensive services, but the rules weren't really set up to support it. So with that context, in 2014, so last year, the FCC made two major legal changes to the program. And in the world of the FCC, to do two major orders like that in 1 year is sort of historic and unprecedented. I mean, Washington does not move that quickly usually, but it was a huge priority. And so we did two orders, and I'll just summarize the couple of big changes and then talk a little bit about how I think they apply. And then I think it'll transition very well to Tony's presentation. So, first, money. We expanded the permanent size of E-rate by 65%. So until 2014, E-rate was about a $2.5 billion a year program nationally. We increased that from 2.5 to 3.9. And as I said before, that's just the ongoing annual level. That's not a one-time. That is just an annual stream. So what does that mean? Well, over the next 5 years, E-rate is going to fund around $22 to $24 billion nationally for school technology, and that's a lot of money, even in Washington. Now, it wasn't just money. I mean, for us, the money was essential, really for two reasons. The reason the money was important was the first, what I said at the beginning, which is giving confidence to states and localities that there was money there. Because as we're going to talk about in a minute, a lot of the success case here does require some stepping up at the local level, and the last thing you want to do is say, well, there's some federal money this year, but what about next year? And then we'll be left in a lurch. Having really clear signaling that the money is there was the first reason. The second reason is there was a ton of analysis been done. Tony's organization was one of the best experts on it. That just looked at this. I mean, you would think the federal government would know this, but we actually had to do a lot of work to find out. What is the state of connectivity to schools in the country? How many schools have fiber optic connections? And that's what we're talking about here. To support anything like what you're envisioning, you need fiber connections, or my technologist colleagues would say, every now and then in a very remote rural area, maybe you would use a certain wireless technology, but really 99% of the time we're talking fiber connections to every school in the country. And we had to do a lot of work to assess, well, what even is that starting point? And what we found was there was a pretty big gap. And the most important gap really is in either rural or at least, schools that are far outside of the urban, suburban core. And there really is a kind of a two-part story here. If you are talking about schools in not just dense urban areas, but in a metroplex, Dallas, Houston, Washington, Boston, wherever, there's plenty of telecom infrastructure. And the issues for those schools go more around how much they're paying and how they're using it. But if you're talking about rural areas or the school that's in a small town, there really are in some parts of the country issues around there's no one right now that will provide fiber to that school. And we have lots of examples where school districts, we had one from North Florida that came in and talked to us that said they had a group of schools, they had tremendous local will to get high-speed fiber to all these rural schools in North Florida, and they could not find anyone that would build to them because it's expensive to build infrastructure in these low-density areas. So in addition to the money being a signaling factor, we also said we need to make sure there's enough money that if there is a few years of extra investment required to build to rural schools, and it does. It might cost you $500,000, $1 million to build a fiber connection to that rural school, but E-rate will pay for that, and it'll be expensive. But that's the other reason why we added the funding, because the goals really are all schools, not just the ones that happen to live close enough to dense areas where it doesn't cost that much. So that was the money. But equally importantly, we made a handful of changes to E-rate that I would just, and Tony's going to talk about some of them in more detail, I would boil it down to this. The real changes expand the tools that are available to schools, to districts, to states who want to tackle this problem. And so E-rate, as good as it was, it evolved with just some limitations, and it gets into real details of you could buy this kind of thing, but not this kind of thing because this kind of thing didn't exist when the rules were made. We fully updated all those rules. And so the way to think about it is there is a very complete tool chest now. If you're a rural school and you don't have a network there, you have an option to pay to have someone build it for you. If you are in an area where a provider has built a network that requires you to help turn it on, you can support that. And if you just want to go to AT&T or Verizon or Comcast or whoever and just pay a relatively normal rate for a normal service, you can do that too. So it's a complete tool chest, and it's a significant amount of funding. But at its core, that's about the most the FCC can do, right? We have kind of created the tool chest and the pile of money next to it. But to go and take advantage of it really is going to be a local driven effort, and that's why these kind of meetings are actually so important for us. Now, the third thing that we did in the orders last year, and again, this sounds sort of obvious that you would do this, but it hadn't been done before, we set specific goals for E-rate. Three goals. First goal, to support every school in the country, every library too, but we're talking schools here, to be able to get to, we set a short-term and a long-term goal on connection speed to the school. In the short term, 100 megabit connection to every school, right? So at home, if you have a fancy broadband connection, you might have 10 megabit service or something to your home. 100 megs for a school that's doing digital learning is good, and it's, I think, a good representation of kind of the current state of play. But the short-term goal. Long-term goal is every school to have a 1 gigabit per second connection, and that's a real stretch from today. I think a lot of schools or district technology people would say today that might be a bit of overkill. But go back to what I said a couple minutes ago. All the data shows the demand doubles every 2 to 3 years, and given the planning cycles required here, all the work it takes to do these projects, a couple years is a blink of an eye. And so that question of what goal do you want to think of? What's the goal you want to set at the state level? Up to you. But our federal goal was 100 megs to a gig, short term to long term. Second goal, and this is really important, is affordability. So the FCC does not say you can only pay a certain price for a certain service. It's a bottom-up effort and reflects the fact that prices vary locally and there's lots of differences around the country. But because local schools do pay part of the freight, and because it is more expensive to have a gigabit connection than a 100 megabit connection, or certainly than a 10 megabit connection, that cost pressure will always be there. And another big conclusion from the work that we did over the last couple of years is there's a huge range of what schools pay for these services. Now, just actually yesterday, we put up at the FCC, actually I was one of the co-authors, a little blog post on our FCC website that was the first of what's going to be a series of data we're going to be putting out. And we just started by saying, what's the median price paid in every state in the country for gigabit services? And it varies a lot. I think the insight you might want to think about for your planning is, how can at the state level can you support just getting good prices at the local level? And there's lots of factors. How you do your planning, how you do your purchasing. For example, in the state of North Carolina has a pretty advanced program. They have a central state office that provides both technology planning expertise and helps organize the purchasing processes. And they kind of have this master state process. Now, local districts can opt into it, and it gets that balance of state and local right. But bringing the affordability goal along with the connectivity goal is really going to be important, because if we don't do that, even $3.9 billion a year probably won't be enough. All the data that we've seen says that that is achievable, and from the FCC side, what we're mainly going to do is provide more data and information. So you're going to be able to know, as local participants, what are other people paying for these services, and how might that factor into your planning. And the third goal, we just boiled this down to applicant ease of use. I've said lots of great things about E-rate. I think if you talk to your colleagues that maybe work with E-rate applications historically, it's kind of a bureaucratic nightmare, reality. The application, just all the details. And that can be a barrier. I mean, these projects are very hard to organize, and if it's hard to work with the program, that's a barrier. So the third big goal was really streamlining that experience. I won't go into more detail, but just suffice to say, we set a huge goal on improving essentially the customer service component of E-rate. Okay, so I will wrap up here just with a couple of final observations that I think relate to the task that you're tackling now. So more money, better toolbox. What our hope is at the FCC is that we can help all of the local participants in E-rate. And again, I use the word local just in a very general sense. Local really does mean everything from these fairly coordinated state efforts, North Carolina is a good example, to there are still schools out there that apply to individual schools. And that full spectrum is part of the E-rate world. But whatever that local component is, what we really hope is that we'll see, I would say, just better and smarter use of the tools and the funding to achieve the goals as quickly as possible, however those goals are set by local decision makers. We do really think, though, that the roles of states here is critical, right? And so if you ask sort of what's our opinion at the FCC, having been through all this, I think it's very difficult certainly for individual schools, and even for most school districts. I mean, maybe the biggest ones that, essentially are the size of small states, in what they're doing. But the vast majority of districts, it's pretty hard to do the sophisticated planning. How do you want to build your network? What pieces do you need where? It's very complex, and there are people whose professional careers are thinking about these issues full time. If you don't have some expertise really driving that planning, it's hard to get it right. And the funding is an issue, right? So at the local, think about a rural school district. That whole operating budget, may be a couple $100,000 or maybe $1 million to say, even after the FCC's changes, to get fiber built, you still have to come up with $100,000 for your fiber connection, which is probably a great deal in the broad scheme of things. But if you can't handle that in your operating budget, you're not going to do it. And so this role of how can the states actually help with those funding barriers at the local level was also a big point of emphasis for us. And I want to just highlight then one very specific rule. Tony's going to talk about a lot of the other specific rules. But the one specific rule that we put in place is we call it the state match, the state bonus. Right, so E-rate, as I said, has a basic structure of, depending on the poverty level in the school, it'll pay somewhere between 20 to 80% of the freight. However, we have a special new provision this year, which is, or not this year, it enacted last year, and it is a permanent part of the program. When a school is specifically connecting to high-speed fiber for the first time, so again, think about a rural school, doesn't have fiber to it, and it's going to do a project to build that fiber. If the state participates with a little bit of money from the state, the FCC will match that money dollar for dollar on top of whatever else E-rate already provides. So the simplest way to think about it is, let's say it's a relatively high poverty rural school, that under normal E-rate rules, 80% of the money would be paid by E-rate, but 20% would have to be paid by the local school. Okay. Let's say they want to build fiber to that school and it costs $1 million. Just the one-time capital expense is $1 million. Under current rules, that local district has to come up with $200,000. However, if the state has a fund that puts in $100,000, we'll add in $100,000 too, additional to the first $800,000. And so that school really can then get fiber built with nothing out of pocket. Or there could be some flexibility. Maybe you want some local money, but the school district pays, $20,000 or $30,000, and we could also let them spread it out over time. So this idea of how do you get around every single possible barrier there is to every school, not just the one that's in the areas where it's relatively easy, but in every school, that's our focus. We do think that the role of state efforts like what you're planning is really critical to success. I mean, I would say other than a few exceptions, we've not seen real success cases that don't involve this kind of coordinated state thinking. Doesn't mean the state does everything, but the state planning is really important. And then the last thing is, the FCC, we are a small agency, so we do not have a big national field force that's out there helping, day to day with every application. But we do have a pretty talented senior staff that when we're talking about the level of a state effort like this, and we can coordinate directly, we are extremely interested in being helpful. So, I was very, very eager to fly down and be part of this discussion, but, if it's helpful, this definitely should not be the last conversation. And we can provide a lot of helpful guidance because notwithstanding how simple I described to you right at the beginning, there's complexity to it. But we have people that know it as well as you can know it. And if you do get down this road and start to get into more detailed questions, we are extremely, extremely interested in helping in a very consultative way, steer the path forward. So I think we have that. I'm going to just literally hand off because a lot of what Tony's going to talk about, I think, will just flow very directly. Or do you want
take a couple questions now?
Yeah.
No, let's keep going. We'll ask questions at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you for having us to speak on such an important topic to our country and to the state of Texas. What I'd like to do here is follow on John's talk about the policy and what's happening on the ground in terms of what your districts are facing, the kind of transformation that they're going through, some of the challenges that they face, and kind of the status. And then I'm also going to talk about what Mr. Wilkins was just saying at the end there, the roles that some states have played that have proven to be very successful, because we really see this as a problem of scale. And you've got a very big state, but you also have a lot of districts in this state, and getting some kind of collective action can be a challenge. But it's only through scale that some of these problems get solved. So we are Education Superhighway. We are a nonprofit. We are nonpartisan. We're fully philanthropy funded. We're offering advisory services to state governments at no cost to the state of Texas. We're currently engaged in an initial study that I'll talk about in a second. But what I first want to do is give you an overview of what broadband looks like in the schools and why this is such a big change for the districts and some of the challenges they face. So our mission, quite simply, is to enable all the things that were discussed earlier in the hearing, this massive transformation to digital content, not just sort of electronic versions of books, but entire operating plan for platforms that offer adaptive learning and infrastructure and operational support to the entire school is now possible, whereas in my generation that was not possible, enabling a much higher degree of personalization and the ability to deploy some of the kind of cognitive things that the previous speaker talked about in terms of giving students more stimulation, more personalization so they learn faster and better. We've got some, again, generous philanthropy funding from some of the major foundations in technology and education supporting this. So we're here at no cost. I just want to highlight a couple really great things going on in the state of Texas. Again, this massive transformation means that some of your major districts are already on this very steep path that we've been talking about of broadband requirement. From rolling out one-to-one laptops to BYO type things is putting enormous strain on the Wi-Fi networks in the schools. So this is happening all over the country. I think there's a lot of districts here in Texas that are leading this charge. But this is increasingly, again, putting a lot of demand on the networks. And depending on the school, depending on the sort of leadership, human capital, and other sort of dynamics going on, some schools are more equipped to handle this challenge and some are not. So I want to give you an idea quickly of what this really looks like. We've seen this sort of very rapid 50 to 100% type annual growth in demand for bandwidth within a school in many different places around the country. At one end of the spectrum, technology is still considered like a laboratory resource, a scarce resource almost, where you have to walk down a hall, schedule time, and if the network works, everything's great. That kind of supports what we call just a very basic level of access. Maybe the school with very sophisticated planning can pull off a major assessment by rotating folks through the gymnasium one day, and that's a fairly low bandwidth requirement for most of those assessments. And what we see this is an organic process. We have, pioneering teachers that want to use technology in the classroom, are able to round up enough resources to make that happen. Their peers start imitating and learning about this. We see this adoption curve going up, where you start seeing it enter the classroom and become part of the lesson, but not systematically. I think that, the schools that are the most evolved are at the other end of the spectrum, where it's really what we, in regular life with our smartphone take for granted. Instant access to really literally anything on the internet is interwoven in the classroom and is very much a robust and reliable resource that can be counted on. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of schools off at the left end of the spectrum. They've tried to get to the right, but any teacher that stood up in front of 28 students and have technology fail on them is not going to do that again. So it's a level of, again, robustness and reliability that's required to enable the adoption even to happen. Because as we all know, with the way teachers adopt materials, they have to believe it. They have to be confident. And there's even been quite a bit of infrastructure spending where all the linkages don't work. And I'll talk about them in a second. And this is called a wireless access point. A teacher could be standing underneath the radio, hitting the device, and there's no response from the device. Things like that, misspent capital is something that is one of the barriers that gets involved in making the whole system work. And again, that loss of confidence is really a lost opportunity for the digital age. So again, we're on this very, very steep curve. 50 to 100% annual growth is extraordinary by any measure. And the way this works is a lot like plumbing. I use this graphic because it's really a very kind of interdependent set of linkages. And just like at home, if you've got a bottleneck or a leak somewhere, the water's not going to come out the other end. And what that looks like in the classroom is this is a very, very simplified view of it, but from the great big internet on the left down to your student on the right, they're really a set of linkages. The districts get their internet from internet providers through the telecom infrastructure. There's various carriers that provide services like that. Then the schools access the internet through often a connection to their district. Sometimes they go directly. Sometimes, like in the state of Texas, there are regional aggregation groups, the ESCs in this state, that help folks get some scale and procure this for them. But in a very simplified sense, you have different pipes, and then what John talked about was once it gets inside the building, there's a wholly different set of equipment that distributes that, called the Wi-Fi network. So this is really a very interdependent set of linkages, and the reason I make the analogy to plumbing is that they all have to be tuned well. We've seen places that have invested in Wi-Fi without investing in the other pipes. So you've got a real bottleneck upstream, but you've got the best Wi-Fi equipment the money can buy. That doesn't always work, and that comes down to, as Mr. Wilkins was saying, is planning, the right expertise in the right place to make sure that that network is tuned for the kind of demands that the school is going to be placing on it. So there are now goals that have been set out by the FCC and other national bodies that we support in terms of how to think about these linkages. These are standards that schools can shoot towards for these set of linkages. And they're, very simply, the 1 megabit per student is a 2018 FCC and CETA goal. Fiber transport, that linkage sometime between the district and the school can be a bottleneck. We want to make sure that's a very big, open, scalable sort of highway. And then Wi-Fi, modern Wi-Fi equipment that can support one-to-one, meaning that can it support, let's say 30, even 35 students simultaneously accessing the internet, accessing high bandwidth applications like video, et cetera. And the great news is that there are entire industries that focus on this and do this every day. The telcos, folks like Cisco and Meraki, this is very mature technology, but making it work in the classroom is, in a state like Texas, is an issue of coordination, expertise, planning to really optimize the federal funding that's coming in. So the other, so these are the guidelines for 2018. Just the left-hand goal of internet access for 2014 was 100K, so that 1/10 of the bandwidth that is sort of forecast to be needed by 2018. Again, nobody really knows where we're going to be in 2018, but we've already seen districts that are consuming 200-300 kilobits per second. So we're very much on that path somewhere, and that is, again, a marked sort of departure from where we were just a few years ago. Just a few years ago, when we were launching Education Superhighway, the average school was getting equivalent to about what an average home got. So 400 kids versus 4 consumers. We're sort of drinking from the same kind of service. And again, as these pioneering teachers have gone out there and embraced these new technologies and these new opportunities, shortages happened, which is why the FCC was so quick to act in addressing the funding mechanism to provide these upgrades. So we've kind of touched on some of these things already, but what we see in the field in studying this across the country in many places is that there are different types of roadblocks. Some of them are simply economic. Districts don't always have the funding. They haven't thought about the sustainable infrastructure part of their school system because it's just a new issue for them. They may not have the human capital, the expertise in place to really understand it well. Also, again, several years ago, there were no goals. So it's very hard to plan when you don't know what the goals are, you don't know what the demand is. Also, as is going to be very much the case here in Texas, service providers without a commercial interest in a locale, it's going to be hard or very expensive to get service. So a lot of rural districts out here in the central and western part of the state, really all over, that's going to be an issue. There's going to be less competition out there, which is, again, why E-rate modernized to fund those specific applications and enable, that funding stream to connect those folks who are really out there in a very disadvantaged situation. The other thing that we see is really what I call more of an organizational dynamic going on. We see that the states that have scalable infrastructure for their schools and a high level service really had early leadership. Like MCNC, the North Carolina situation is a great example of this, where they made it a priority, figured out a way to, again, get scale on the problem. School districts are pretty small buyers for telecom and for network equipment. So they're not in a great position to negotiate, but by aggregating them together in a centralized service agency, much like what they did in North Carolina, much like what your ESCs are maybe already doing or could be doing, is a way to get scale on the problem, to create this collective behavior. I want to emphasize, too, that this is a commodity. Unlike the content stuff that is probably going to be debated very hotly here today, broadband is a commodity. And it should be purchased as a commodity. It's almost like I like to make the analogy to buying toilet paper. I buy my toilet paper at Costco. I know that in a jam I can go to 7-Eleven and get it for $3.99, and it's a really nice, wrapped one, single serving. But at Costco, for 64 rolls, the cost goes down to maybe 23 cents. That's really the analogy to think of. When we can buy a commodity at scale, we can be much more efficient about it. The other benefit that you get from buying it at scale is sort of an implied technical standard. Again, the fragmentation issue that exists with schools and its sort of individual behavior at a district level, often there is no tech director at a school. There's the superintendent, who's also the principal, and the teacher. I know that exists at some scale here in Texas. That expertise gap will never be solved. So we need to think about what's a sustainable model for procuring technology given the fragmentation that exists in the field with public education. So it's really, the opportunities, again, that we see that have been proven in other states are different kinds of aggregation. Aggregations of expertise, aggregations of purchasing, aggregations of, operations, of support. The E-rate program by itself, very complex thing. Some states have just simply hired, E-rate consultants for their districts to help them with the application process so they can take advantage of the funding. And again, given the sort of overall level of poverty here in Texas. You know, the E-rate program is a huge opportunity for many of your districts and can often pay for most, if not all, of the broadband in those places. So I think we've talked about all these things. Again, I want to emphasize the leverage issue, given, again, that the scenario that John just went through. For a fiber build, for an 80% reimbursement district with a state match, that district can get a connection and cover their non-recurring costs at no cost to them, with some kick-in from the state. Again, because of the scale nature of this problem, we see that as a tremendous opportunity to get, especially the very disadvantaged rural districts, onto this opportunity in the short term. So real quickly, this, from an initial analysis of the data that the FCC was so good to make public, we've done our analysis of the status of K-12 connectivity here in Texas. So here's how your linkages look right now. Relative to the 2014 standard of 100 kilobits of access per student, there are only about a third of districts that are not meeting that standard. I think that's great news. But as we look forward to the 2018 goal, only 2% are currently meeting it. So you know, we're also seeing a lot of unscalable services, you know, T1 lines and other copper services in this state. That's, again, from a digital learning point of view, that's going to max out very, very quickly, and they're going to need to get on some kind of fiber service to meet the 2018 goals and to be consuming in a media-rich, in a technology-available environment. On the linkage side, we call transport, those fiber connections between the districts, and the buildings. About 15% are not currently on fiber. Again, I suspect these are the rural schools. Again, the funding mechanism that the FCC's put in place is, again, an opportunity to correct a lot of these shortages. And the last piece, again, is the Wi-Fi piece. Some of your districts are drawing down that fund. I suspect that they're doing that all autonomously, which is great. They're taking advantage of it. But we've also seen some really effective management models where that kind of purchasing activity can be standardized. So instead of a 30% discount from Cisco, you can get a 60% discount from Cisco if you just run your master contract and engage your districts in a way that you can negotiate a better deal. So again, it's a collective action kind of opportunity because of this fragmented nature of purchasing in the districts. And we've seen, again, a lot of great examples of this around the country that we're looking forward to sharing with the folks, the policymakers in Texas. So here's where, just to tie back into what John was talking about, the Category 1, again, those upstream connections, and Category 2, how it works. Right now, it's $2.9 billion in those upstream connections, with this special provision for if you don't have a fiber connection, which is something you're going to need to have. There's a special funding for that, with the opportunity to get a state match. For Category 2, the stuff that's in the building, there's an additional $1 billion, and there's sort of an allowance and a schedule for districts to participate in that. Again, it looks like your districts are starting to do that. Again, there can be a role in helping support better purchasing in that department, so they just get more for their money. And obviously, by saving money there, they can spend money on other things like teachers and content.
Actually, Tony, one just quick observation.
Sure.
That $311 million that's available to Texas schools, the data that I have just for, like, as of this week, that's being tapped at about a 30% rate right now in Texas. Right now, looks like this year maybe about 140 million is going to actually be requested. So just that right there shows a bit of the gap. So as Tony said, what's happening right now on those internal connections, it's very much just a grassroots, and some districts are doing it, some aren't. But there's money on the table, just as one observation on the internal connections.
So say that gap again. So we've applied for 100, say that one more time.
So as of this week, it was about 110 million had been committed, and we're not quite done yet, so that'll go up a little bit. So it looks like Texas is on track to probably 130 million, to be my guess, where you're going to end up this year for those Category 2 funds. And the reason you can do the analysis that way, we have a relatively simple allocation method for those funds. It's kind of just based on how many students you have. And so you can just say, okay, Texas, how many students you have, what percent of the country, kind of do that math, and there's a gap. that right now is not being tapped because it's very bottoms up.
And what we have available to us, 311 million?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm
Again, I
sorry,
want to
go ahead.
emphasize that that's kind of the organic, grounds-up nature and the way the program was designed. But again, there's a role for the state here potentially in just with the purchasing side of this, because again, if it can be aggregated together and made to be a simultaneous purchase, we've seen vendors giving much bigger discounts. So that's just one example again of where the state can support the districts and getting better economies on this challenge.
So in the Category 1 funding, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure we get this slide. Do we have a gap there as well?
You can't simplify it quite that way. Category
Okay.
1, it really depends on the local conditions.
Okay.
So.
That's fine. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the Category 2 really works more as an allocation. Right. So I want to sort of end here with kind of a summary of some of the lessons we've seen in other states and what the opportunity is for the state action that we've been talking about. Sort of on the upstream side in terms of driving, the economics and the long-term sustainability of broadband in the schools. There are things that we've seen other states conduct that really help drive leadership and this kind of collective action and exploiting some of these economies that exist. The first thing, I want to commend TEA for taking the lead on this, is the report that's about to be issued. Let's just start studying the problem. Let's figure out what your status actually is. Even, John mentioned at the national level, when the program was being formed, it wasn't clear what the status is. Same is true in every state. Until policymakers really know what the status of broadband is, it's very hard to advance the conversation to figure out what the gaps are and what the opportunities are. So the TEA report that's coming out, I think, is going to address fiber availability. We just kicked off a project at the behest of the governor yesterday to deliver our connectivity report as a supplement to that, which goes into some of the costs and some of the structural aspects of how broadband is procured in this state. Once we understand that, we can see better where some of the opportunities are to launch programs or tune the procurement to provide again, better economies for the districts. At the second point there, districts, again, there's a real human capital deficit at an operating level in a lot of these districts. In the old days of computing, you could buy a piece not that long ago, 20 years ago, you buy a PC, throw a couple floppy disks in it, and that's your content. It's a completely different technical challenge which requires different skills now that administrators, superintendents, teachers are expected to procure on behalf of their districts. Many districts just don't have the scale for that. And now with this fiber funding from the FCC, it's an extraordinary opportunity, but the skill requirement is even higher. So we have an offering at EducationSuperHighway that helps districts do that. We're discussing deploying that now with TEA and the governor's office, but some level of support so that, number one, folks understand the opportunity, and two, they know how to procure that, because it's a different kind of procurement than what they're used to potentially. If there's no commercial vendor, there's a provision in the E-rate order for self-provisioning, which is hiring an engineering company and doing a whole bunch of things that they're not used to doing. So again, that's a level of expertise that would need to be enabled somehow at large scale in this state to happen. The last point on the left side is try to increase the bandwidth and affordability through these things we've been talking about, like what North Carolina did. And I know the ESCs are very active here in supporting districts in this way, getting some form of aggregation so you can buy the 64 rolls of toilet paper rather than the single roll, get better economies through purchasing scale. Also, affordability, the FCC has made the data on E-rate transparent so soon. We will have a portal where districts can go themselves using this data to compare, what am I buying versus what my neighbor is buying from the same carrier, same product type. Again, give them better negotiating power when they're making those purchase decisions as a way to drive the cost down. So those kinds of empowerment tools and education can go a long way in reaching these goals. And the last point I think we've made about the Wi-Fi opportunity, given again this new funding, procurement help can bring the cost down further than what a district can negotiate on their own. Again, I don't want to underemphasize, there's also kind of a technical design benefit you get from doing things in aggregate as well, because when you purchase that, it's a chance to kind of standardize the designs of a Wi-Fi and make sure that the schools are bringing it up to the right standard. Because again, really, it's the way K-12 works is you just got a lot of small schools out there making decisions on their own in a domain they don't fully understand. There's a big expertise gap. So wherever we can fill the expertise gaps and create a collective action with the right expertise is where you're going to see wins.
Oh. Members, yes, Mr. Maynard.
I just, and maybe this is a question for John, but does E-rate support maybe efforts through intergovernmental agreements? For instance, when you talk about education, we may not always be just talking simply about the public school, because frequently the library that is operated by the municipal government, or possibly the cooperative extension service that's operated really by the county government, can all be part of that. And then, but if you can support, that connectivity to all those entities in a rural community. Yep. And for instance, like the local library may be also supporting efforts for high school equivalency and all kinds of manner of things. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So I would say at a strategic policy level, what you just described has been a big focus for us. So E-rate is actually one of 4 different programs that's all part of what's called the Universal Service Umbrella. So there's E-rate. There's a program for rural health care, rural health clinics and rural hospitals. There's a program for just rural, we call it high cost, but that almost always is rural, just networks for any use. And historically, those were somewhat in different swim lanes, but exactly as you were describing, a lot of times these projects make a lot more sense to be not just designed and built, but frankly funded efficiently by bringing those different local needs together. So for example, we actually already have a policy in place that lets a rural health care and an E-rate project be done jointly and efficiently. In the E-rate reform we did last year, we added some provisions around also connecting that to just the general rural build-out support that we give for any need. And the challenge is always, because these programs have a lot of rules, and you have to make sure you comply with them. The basic spirit of E-rate is the money that comes from the E-rate program should be tied to the school activity. And the same is true, say, for the rural healthcare program. So to do what you're describing, the key thing really is that just the project planning, you can just describe what you're doing relative to those needs. And the way I kind of think about it is forget the federal government. Let's just say it was a board of directors or your local supervisors who just really wanted to know, okay, so you say it's going to cost this many millions of dollars. Just show us how, even if some of the costs are shared, how are the shared costs divided up among the needs? And then some part of the project may be just for the schools, because building the one part that goes to the school. The FCC programs are certainly tilting more and more towards trying to support that kind of efficient process, but it does have a little bit more of a planning requirement where, so the watch out can be sometimes we hear hey, we have this great project and it's solve all these needs and we just need this much money. And there's not the the breakdown that you do sort of need to show how it fits with the programs. But with that extra level of planning, the answer is yeah. And we think that's actually a really important point, because you don't want a world where, because you have different federal programs, you sort of build these duplicative solutions that are frankly more expensive than they should be, because you don't do that kind of joint planning.
I just want to follow up too, is that you kind of mentioned about infrastructure. You used the analogy of pipes. I had a subcontractor do a piece of work on a project that I had and used the cheapest possible pipes possible. I mean, right. And that was a problem.
Right.
I'm just curious if, I know that that's a commodity, broadband is, but in terms of the internal infrastructure within the building, there are some differences in that. And sometimes is that when we're trying to put a $5 bill or a $10 bill ought to go, and we kind of have a low bid mentality because we have to, is that sometimes a problem And is there a document out there that maybe that, I'll give you an example. Years ago for career and technical education, we had a number of entities in the state that put out facility guidelines. Is that, well, okay, he says that if you're going to do this sort of career and technical, we used to call vocational education facility, here are some of the standards for that, and as in that way that whoever was doing the work on that would look at that and say, this is what we need. Is there a document out there, of course, and of course it has to be updated constantly, but is there any kind of document out there that gives that kind of guidance to local districts?
Yes. I want to address the quality issue on a couple levels, though. Probably at the very end of the network and the Wi-Fi is where quality can have the most variance, and different people's notion of standards may vary the most. I think it's converging on kind of a fairly tight band from the bodies of research that we've seen, and we have our own Wi-Fi buyer's guide that's on our website now. We also have a piece called Broadband for Superintendents, so to help policymakers at a local level understand the concept. I know a gentleman from CETA is talking later. There are other kind of research bodies that have studied that very problem. But yes, like the cheap wiring would be the equivalent of what you're talking about with your
right.
plumbing project. Hopefully that turned out well. But yeah, there are ways to build that are kind of generally acceptable. And again, I think it's converging on a fairly narrow band, and we prescribe some of those in our Wi-Fi buyer guide. And there are other technical bodies that try to standardize network design. But again, my point about commodity purchasing, the toilet paper was maybe an extreme example, but that single roll at 7-Eleven is often a slightly nicer quality. But the range of quality requirement for the school applications is lower than what exists in commercial industry. And this comes down to expertise, and probably the local experts in the regions and the districts will come to some kind of opinion on what the standard network design could be. But again, these are very mature technologies, but they do need to be implemented well. A big issue in a lot of very mundane issue in a lot of schools is the wiring, literally drawing the cables through to connect the access points to the central networking and out to that big pipe. But again, there are reputable vendors in every region. Good, smart purchasing folks should know about those and have access to them and know how to run a process to get the best value for money. So again, that's my point about their entire industries built around servicing this. So we've got the federal funding, we've got the industries. Often, some of the breakages are that local expertise and a procurement vehicle or a body or a way to get scale so that we can get all that expertise in. Again, last night at dinner I heard about a lot of very, very small districts in Texas, and it's going to be a real challenge for them. And even the moderate-sized districts, this is a level of procurement that did not exist even 10 years ago. And a level of sort of network design and IT expertise required in the field.
Ms. Cargill's got a question, then we will do our break.
Yeah. So, Tony, about going back to the best practices that you mentioned in North Carolina, could you give us some bullet points on what they're doing? I think I met probably some of the folks there at
Yes.
a conference in Denver recently, and they do have it going on. But could you just summarize for members some bullet points about what they're doing that we probably should look at
that's
carefully?
probably, I would say, maybe the most robust form of a centralized approach, where they've really taken on the role of being a service provider down to the level of even network design and tech support, network tech support at a local level in a district. So they've taken that on because again, they saw the fragmentation issue in their state. They saw that their schools would really never be able to get to a level of expertise that was required for an equitable level of access. And again, I want to emphasize the equity issue, because this is now increasingly an issue where the small schools will really never have that expertise there. So how do you solve that, right? You'd have to do some kind of centralization. Now, whether that be statewide or we've seen some very successful models like in New York with the RICs that have like mini MCNCs that are taking on all the provisioning on behalf of their districts, and they can hire in a really high-powered CTO and sort of staff to operate that. We have other materials that glad to make available to the board, documenting some of these sort of case studies and our buyer's guide and things like that. Be happy to distribute those to the board after the talk.
Absolutely.
We'd
Thank
like
you so
that.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, did you
Can I
have
make
something
just,
to add?
I want one other quick on Mr. Maynard's question to Tony. From the E-rate, we mentioned low bid. Very important, maybe closing thought for us would be E-rate is not a low bid program. Okay. The most important concept from the program side is what we call cost effectiveness. And so the legal standard for E-rate is price has to be a primary factor, but you can have other factors. So you can have other factors for what you want to buy and who you want to buy from, standards around technology, service levels. And so the mindset that we really are trying to encourage applicants to get into is think about it as if it's an investment mindset, and just think about it if it's all your money, right? These projects sometimes will require a trade-off. It may cost a little more in year one because you'll get much better pricing or better service or performance over years 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you can do that under E-rate. E-rate is not a federal program that says you have to prove this is the absolute lowest price you can pay this year, which if used effectively is a huge advantage. I mean, it really is a powerful thing because it gives you such a greater ability to do these things the right way. The flip side is if it's abused, that can also be a road to trouble, so we have to monitor that around audits and things. But cost effectiveness is not low price. It's show that the value is there, and all these things Tony's talking about kind of play into that. And it's a huge opportunity for what you're trying to do is how do you implement that at the state level.
Thank you both. We really appreciate it. And members, I'm sure you'll have questions. So we've got a break right now, and we'll reconvene at 10:25. It's going to be a short break.